Break from our Wednesday night studies. Hope everybody had an enjoyable Thanksgiving during that Thanksgiving break. We just want to make sure that we're getting back into the groove, and we've got a session 22 is tonight of our study Kingdom Come. Tonight's 3 chapters worth. I think I told you that it would be 2, but I went ahead and did 3 and there's a reason why. So we're going to do 3 chapters tonight and a lesson called The End of the Line. By the time we're through with tonight's lesson, just to give you some perspective, we will have gone about 200 years into just the divided portion of the kingdom, okay? About 200 years worth. The kingdom divided in 930 BC. And when we get to the end of tonight's lesson, the northern kingdom will be no more. It's gone into exile. And that happened in 722 BC. And then the southern kingdom and our rest of our study will go on in up to the date of 586 BC when Judah will go into exile. So these are chapters 15, 16, and 17, the end of the line. And we'll start with our summaries of each of these chapters, and there's going to be a little more reading of the text tonight, and plus the fact that we have an additional chapter than we normally do, so we're going to go ahead and start. One of the confusing things, by the way, and what I wished they would have done, although I wasn't in charge, they didn't ask me, I wish they would stick with one name for the same person. You know what I mean? Just stick with one name, okay? Azariah is also known as Uzziah, and later on will be referred to as Uzziah. But for now, he's being referred to as Azariah. He becomes king of Judah at the age of 16, and he reigns for quite a while, 52 years. Melba, make sure you get you a guide if you want, right on the chair. And here is a summation of his reign. This is given in chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his forefather had been. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son to succeed him, and by making Jerusalem strong. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. So there's a summation of Azariah's reign, okay? And how many times would you wish, I guess the question, don't you wish you had $1 for every summation of a king's reign that sounds the same? Because this is like a broken record, isn't it? It just keeps going and going, and tonight you're really going to see that. Now, God afflicts Uzziah with what? Leprosy. And he has to live in a house separate all by himself. Now, he's king for 52 years. At some point when he gets this leprosy, he pretty much is, sequestered. He's quarantined, because that's the rule about leprosy. And that was the cultural stigma about leprosy. So basically, he becomes, while being king, a lame duck, meaning that his son Jotham becomes in charge of the palace and his people. Jotham will become king, but he basically is also king during his father's reign, or acting as proxy, I guess. Zechariah becomes king of Israel in Uzziah's 38th year. He only reigns 6 months. A summation of his reign is verse 9, which reads, that's the wrong verse. I'm in the wrong book. Why am I looking at 1 Kings? Sorry. Let's go to 2 Kings. Why was I in 1 Kings? Did I read the wrong summation? I think I did. Did I? I sure did. Y'all ever make that mistake? I didn't think I ever made those mistakes. So now I feel like I have to go back and get the correct summation of Uzziah's reign. But it'll probably sound the same because, again, it's like a broken record. But let's make sure we read that right. I'm going to go back up to my second bullet point just to make sure we got Uzziah's summation right. Yeah, we were way off because it didn't have any of that part about David in there. Okay, verse 3, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Amaziah had done. The high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burnt incense there. Don't you wish you had $1 every time you heard something that sounded the same? Now, that is different than the summation I read, but still, it's a repeat, isn't it? And that little refrain kind of sneaks its way back in there. The high places, however, were still there, right? All right, now we're on the right track. Let's now go to the summation of Zechariah's reign, and that is verse 9, and then I think we'll be leveled up. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord as his predecessors had done. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. Shallum conspires against Zechariah, attacking him and assassinating him in front of his own people, and then succeeded him as king. So Zechariah doesn't stay king very long. Shallum is king, and this fulfilled the prophecy that had been spoken about Jehu's descendants, that he would have a descendant on the throne till the 4th generation. That's noted in verse 12. Now, if you think Zechariah's reign was short, Shallum's only lasted 1 month instead of 6. Being assassinated by Menahem. Menahem reigns 10 years. He had read the book on how to avoid assassinations for a while. A summation of his reign is found in verse 18. It says, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord during his entire reign. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. Now, there's one note that is given about him that pretty well sticks with him. I mean, this is something noteworthy, but it's not very pleasant. He attacked a place called Tifsa, and everyone in the city and the vicinity was attacked because of their refusal to open their gates. Okay? And he annihilates the city, and the text said during the attack he had pregnant women ripped open. That's pretty sick. Okay? Pul, which was the name of the Assyrian king at the time, invaded the land, which caused Menahem to pay him 1,000 talents of silver so that he would withdraw as kind of an appeasement offer, but he exacts this from the people of Israel, including the wealthy people who had to pay a certain amount. But Pul did withdraw for the money that was given. Pekahiah, Menahem's son, becomes the next king of Israel. He reigns 2 years. Here's a summation of his reign and his demise, verses 24 through 25. Pekahiah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. One of his chief officers, Pekah, son of Remaliah, conspired against him. Taking 50 men of Gilead with him, he assassinated Pekahiah along with Argob and Ariah in the citadel of the royal palace at Samaria. So Pekah killed Pekahiah and succeeded him as king. Pekah becomes the next king and reigns 20 years, with this summary given in verse 28. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. If we were getting $1 for every time we hear that, we're what, up $4 right now, just this chapter or so, right? So during Pekah's reign, a new king of Assyria that succeeded Pul is Tiglath-Pileser. Tiglath-Pileser is now king of Assyria, and he attacked several areas, including Gilead, Galilee, the whole area that belonged to the tribe of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria. This is actually the first deportation of Israelites into exile, but it's a small fragment compared to what will happen by the time we get to the end. So during this time of Menahem's reign then, Pekah's reign, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how our king's doing, because he's allowed the foreign king to come in and take some of our people away and to take our land away. Okay? One of those guys, his name is Hoshea. And Hoshea conspires against Pekah, assassinating him, and succeeded him as the next king. Uzziah's son, Jotham, becomes king of Judah at the age of 25. But remember, his father had leprosy and had been reigning already, and reigned 16 years with this summation, verses 34 and 35. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done. The high places, however, were not removed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Jotham rebuilt the upper gate of the temple of the Lord. And we end the chapter with a note that says, and this is in parentheses in verse 35, that God during this time was sending Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, against Judah. That's chapter 15. Moving on to chapter 16. Ahaz becomes king of Judah when he was 20, reigns 16 years, and the summation is given here in the middle part of verse 2. Unlike David his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel and even sacrificed his son in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places on the hilltops under every spreading tree. Engaging in the detestable practices of the foreigners or the other nations might have been Molech worship. Molech worship is where you sacrifice children through the fire. The drawing I have seen, or rendering from an artist's sketch, was the altar kind of looked like an animal, like a bull or something, but there was a kind of a passageway, like a hole underneath the belly, where the actual fire was burning, and you would take the children from one side, put it through, and then the burnt remains were passed through to the other side. All right? Rezin and Pekah, whom God is sending, right? God is sending them, go up against Ahaz, but they couldn't overpower him. However, Rezin was able to recover one of the areas that Assyria had taken and drove out the people of Judah that had taken up residence there, where Israelites used to be, but allowed Edomites to move in. Ahaz sent a message to Tiglath-Pileser. This is chapter 16, verse 7. The message says, I am your servant and vassal. Now, let's describe what vassal is. Vassal basically means I am at your service doing what you wish for me to do. A vassal king is sort of a puppet king. Does that make sense? And for comparative sake, let me describe how that worked in the New Testament. By the time you get to Jesus and Roman occupation is in the land, Herod was a vassal king. He had no authority over the Roman authority. He was only allowed jurisdiction in regards to Jewish law. Does that make sense? In other words, when Jesus was sent to Herod by Pilate, you can see why the critics were upset with that, because they knew Herod had no power to do with Jesus what they wanted done with Jesus. And Herod basically says, I don't know why you've been sent to me, and sends them back to Pilate. because this charge of blasphemy doesn't make sense to Pilate. It doesn't matter to Pilate. Pilate's biggest deal as far as justification as to why he would go ahead and allow Jesus to be put to death, well, number one, his wife is telling him, I've been warned in a dream about it, but also the fact that his job is maybe in jeopardy for the fact that if Caesar finds out he's not keeping the peace like he ought to be, and there's Jews in the streets saying, crucify him, and he doesn't, rioting may break out. That's the rationalization I think Pilate is using. But Herod is a puppet king. He is a vassal to Caesar. And this is what he becomes to Tiglath-Pileser, Ahaz. Okay? So he says, I am your vassal. Again, what verse was that? Verse 7, I think it was. I'm your vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and the king of Israel who are attacking me. And then he sent him some silver and gold. And the king of Assyria decides, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And he attacks Damascus, capturing it, and deports all the inhabitants to Kir and puts Rezin to death. Rezin was one of those God had been sending during that time. Okay. And while he met with Tiglath-Pileser in Damascus, he sees an altar there. Obviously, an altar that's not the kind of altar that God wants, right? But of the gods of these outside nations. But he likes it so much that he sends plans of this altar back to Jerusalem to a priest named Uriah and instructs him, I want this altar built in front of the temple. Uriah complies, has the altar constructed, removes the altar that's in front of the temple, that's the bronze one, the one that's supposed to be God's, and moves it to the north side of the temple so it's out of the way. And when Ahaz comes back, he begins to offer sacrifices on the new one. Okay? And when he's making these offerings on the new one, Ahaz also gives these instructions to Uriah about how he is to offer on this new one. And this is found in verses 15 and 16. He says to Uriah, the priest, on the large new altar, offer the morning burnt offering and the evening grain offering, the king's burnt offering and his grain offering, and the burnt offering of the people of the land and their grain offering and their drink offering. Splash against the altar the blood of all the burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I will use the bronze altar for seeking guidance. And the bronze altar is referring to God's original altar that's been displaced over on the north side. And Uriah the priest did just as King Ahaz had ordered. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in discussion. And it says at the ending of chapter 16, or toward the end, that he did all this in deference to the king of Assyria. In other words, out of respect for the king of Assyria. We built an altar here, just like the ones you have in Damascus, and this is kind of out of respect for you for helping me out. Okay, chapter 17. Hoshea becomes king of Israel, reigns 9 years. Here's a summation of his reign, verse 2. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. So, okay, he did evil, but he wasn't as bad as the ones before. Okay, there's a little bit of credit maybe in there, hidden in there somewhere. He was bad, but not as bad as the others. Shalmaneser, obviously now is taken over from Tiglath-Pileser. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came to attack Hoshea. Apparently Hoshea had been Shalmaneser's vassal. See, there's that word again. He continued, in other words, this little tribute money that had been paid into, and this agreement that I'm your servant, whatever, I'm subject to you. He is attacked, however, by Shalmaneser because apparently Hoshea had been talking with So, king of Egypt, and had started sending the tribute money to Egypt and said, Shalmaneser, finds out, he puts Hoshea in prison, captures Samaria after like a 3-year siege, deporting all Israelites to Assyria. There's the exile. Everybody's deported. Well, we talk about remnants. That's not mentioned here yet, but there are people that are going to come in and fill up that space. But let's look first of all, since you see the note here, this marks the end of the northern kingdom's existence. The reason is given, and I have this as a long chapter reading because I just felt like we needed to see this. There's a reason why God extracts the judgment or executes the judgment on his people. We start with verse 7. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who'd brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced, namely Jeroboam son of Nebat, right? The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to a fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all the prophets and seers, "Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey and that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets." I want to pause there and go back to that. They had, from every high place, every hill, set up stones. It said when it says under every spreading tree, it reminds me of the very first trip I took to India. And of course in India, you have all kinds of things to be worshipped and revered as sacred or deified. Cows are one of them, the sacred cow, of course. You got other animals that are the same way, monkeys, elephants, all kinds of animals are regarded as perhaps our reincarnated ancestors. This is Hinduism, okay? And the temples and the shrines that are built, and I mean, there are literally, I'm not kidding, there are literally millions of temples. I know I've seen thousands. In Kakinada, where I've been 3 times, there's a street there called Temple Street. Appropriately named, because about every other building is a temple for which you walk by and throw money into. It may have a caged gate type thing that's locked up, or there may be some shaman in there that's accepting your offer and you can go in and have a blessing from that person. And then on top of that, you don't even have to have a structure. There are so-called priests set up on the corner that have constructed an altar, and you go by and toss some change there. And they're burning incense, and they can blow that on you or take little bowls and cup that smoke and they cup it on your head. And you can watch people all day long walking down the street, stopping at every little temple, tossing in change, getting a blessing from the priest. They want all the prayers they can get because to them, even though this is not Buddhism, but it's like good karma, okay? I want a blessing during my day, and the more I get prayed for, the blessed for, the more I pour in, the better off I am. And what's funny is it doesn't stop in the city. You can travel from the city to a village, and on the way, guess what? There are these shrines, and sometimes it's just a shack. 4 pieces of wood that are put together. Put your money here. And trees. Trees that are decorated with all kinds of edification to a god. And by the way, in the city there are also particular people that are regarded as very important people, leaders of government, local regions, These statues are in the intersections. They're also worshiped as God. There's a staircase, like a fire escape, that leads to the top of the leaders so that you can pour some kind of offering on their head. I mean, that passage there is kind of visualized for me from my personal experiences of traveling all over India. You'll be on it's like, what's a place that's like hardly even exists anymore? What's the name of the town between Deer Creek and Medford, just to the north? Old Township. Numa. I mean, nothing is there except an old barn and a silo type thing, right? And yet, on the way to Numa, after you turn off Highway 11, just imagine that there's a tree or there's a temple right there out in the middle of nowhere that people pay money into. And of course, obviously you can imagine as well, the reason why the bars are on the door and stuff is because if there's money there, people are going to come by and steal that, especially if it's unmanned. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that to your attention, that this is what God is seeing being done as to why he sends his people in exile. Let's pick up in verse 14. But they wouldn't listen. They were stiff-necked as their ancestors who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols, themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, do not do as they do. Now, I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to go ahead and stop there. But you read on to the end of verse 34, and let's just go ahead and read 21. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam son of Nebat their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away. In other words, every king is being referred to as, or compared to as, like Jeroboam son of Nebat did, right? So that keeps going on, and commits a great sin. Verse 22, the Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam. Verse 23, until the Lord removed them from his presence as he had warned through all his servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. Now, that's obviously up to the time of this writing. Later on, they're part of the southern exile and taken to Babylon, and then there will be a restoration. But none of these people that are alive are going to be alive then. Well, what we're just now reading is the fact that all this time God kept warning and warning and warning and warning. I mean, how long have we been in not only the book of 1st or 2nd Kings, but how long have we been reading throughout the Old Testament up to this point that God was warning them that you need to separate yourselves and follow my ways, or else this is going to happen. And up to this time, you can probably imagine, well, how long has it been since the Ten Commandments? Well, we can imagine the Ten Commandments during the time of Moses. That's probably about 1500 BC. Here we are at 722 BC, so you do the math. For that many years, and God's given these stern warnings, and although there has been some regional judgment, and now all of a sudden the whole thing comes to an end and he unplugs Israel. Now Judah's still intact, but they're on thin ice. They'll go a couple of hundred more years, but here's Israel. And now the day comes that finally God says, well, that's it. I'm going to do everything I said. I'm cutting you off from the land, casting you away. That's what he does. Okay, we'll come back and discuss that in a little bit. That was a long reading. Sorry about that, but let's pick up at the middle bullet there. Shalmaneser filled the lands of Israel with Babylonians, Cuthites, and many others I didn't mention, others to settle there. But they did not worship the God of that land. And guess what God does? Well, you heard what happened about the bears in Elisha, right? What happens here? God sends lions to kill some of these people because they're not worshiping as he instructed the people of that land. Even though those people are gone, if you're going to come into this land, I still expect that as my rule. and he sends the lion. Shalmaneser finds out about this, and so he takes one of the priests that's been held captive, instructing them to restore this priest back on the land so that the priest could teach the people the ways that the God of that land ought to be worshiped. But in spite of that effort, each national group, because you got Babylonians, Cuthites, and so many others, decided they just want to go do their own thing, set up their own gods, set up their own shrines, set up their own altars, set up their own high places. You read this in verses 30 through 34. The people from Babylon made Succoth Benoth. Those from Cutha made Nergal. And those from Hamath made Ashima. And the Avites made Nebaz. And Tartak and the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire as sacrifices to Adremelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. They worshiped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshiped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. To this day, they persist in their former practices. They neither worship the Lord nor adhere to the decrees or regulations, the laws and commands that the Lord gave the descendants of Jacob, whom he named Israel. We are then reminded in this chapter of God's expectations. That's 35 through 39. The middle part of verse 35, do not worship any other gods or bow down to them, serve them or sacrifice to them. But the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, the mighty power and outstretched arm, is the one you must worship. To him you shall bow down, and to him offer sacrifices. You must always be careful to keep the decrees and regulations, the laws and commands he wrote for you. Do not worship other gods. Do not forget the covenants I made with you, and do not worship other gods. Rather worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the hand of your enemies. But they would not listen, persisted in their former ways, practices, even while trying to serve the Lord at the same time, and that affected following generations, their children and grandchildren. And that's how that chapter ends. Whew. We got through 3 chapters. And I've done most of the talking. I apologize for that. Thoughts? Lots of idols. It sounds like the new inhabitants of the land of Israel, it almost sounds like, and obviously they originally did anyway, but it sounds like even after having been now transported into this new home for them, since the Israelites have been shoved off, that they just decide, let's just make our own gods. And apparently some of them were some that they had back in Babylon or Cuth or wherever it is they come from. And it almost sounds like they decide, we're just going to make one up. Well, how do idols begin in the first place? They're made up. They're a creation of humans. All idols are creations of humans. Now, that's with the influence of Satan, obviously, but it's like the irony is just so apparent. When you read the prophets, Isaiah has a chapter on this about how ridiculous it sounds that a guy goes into his shop, takes a piece of marble, carves it the way he wants, into the figurine he wants. His own hands have created it. He sets it up, and it's almost as if his mind now forgets that he had done that, and he believes that's the God who made him and will deliver him. You did that. You came up with this, but somehow you're deluded to the degree that you feel like you were driven to do this. This is the person. This is the God. This is the golden calf. This is that. This is this. And how could any human being get to the point that, well, you choose that God and y'all have that God. We want one we want to kill our children with. How do you ever come to that conclusion? And we're not even talking about kings who assassinated their own kids for the threat that was on their throne. We're talking about, we just want to do that to worship our God. Killing children is a good way to worship God. That's what they had concluded. How do you come up with that? This is how demented the society had become. Now, let's push pause on that condition spiritually of mankind. And how far off is it from the spiritual condition of mankind from Noah's day, when every inclination of their thoughts were only evil continually? How far off do you think we are? I mean, really, I'm not sure you're that far off. Mmm. Mmm. We're God. That's what we want to play. We're God. However, do you catch the part there, especially in this latter chapter, how they went ahead and did these old things, but they still also try to worship God? Did you see that? And I wonder if that attempt is still being made today. God, we know you're there, and we do want to pay you tribute, but we also have our own thoughts and our own ways. I mean, I'm not agreeing that you do, but yes. There's a...
We're doing this because we're doing plan. But just in case,
Yes.
we're going to do this.
That's exactly right. So it's the idea that we call pluralism. And pluralism is the majority of religions in this world. To my knowledge, now correct me if you know of a different one, but to my knowledge, there are only 3 religions in this world that are monotheistic. Monotheistic, meaning just one God. And I'm probably going to get into trouble saying this, because I have before. The 3 different religions have the same one God. You know? Now, I get in trouble saying that because a lot of people want to say, well, Muslims don't. Because Muslims one, Jews are the other, and Christianity is a third. But Muslims worship the God we worship. They believe the God of Abraham is their God. Okay? Now, they have the false view of what God is. And the false, when they would, this is not politically correct to say, and it really triggers, well, it triggers jihad, I guess. But Muhammad is a false prophet. But they would say of us that we're full of false prophets. But the 3 monotheistic religions in this world are in, I'm not going to say the minority, because our numbers are pretty good, especially collectively. Our numbers between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we probably dominate. But there's only the 3 among the thousands of other religions that include pluralism, multiple gods. Now, we would say polytheism, that means multiple gods, but pluralism, polytheism is kind of like, polytheism is, I can choose a different God among the many gods besides your God. Pluralism is like going to the buffet and I want a little bit of this God, that God, that God, that God, that God. Kind of like at Mars Hill. Because they only have the unknown God in case they missed one. In case we left one out, and there's where Paul steps in and says, this is the one I'm saying is the only one. He made all of you. None of these other, he's implying this is the God I'm telling you about. Monotheism is not popular because it calls for an exclusive, loyal heart, when pluralism allows for other views. That can't we just all get along? Can't we just all believe what we want? Can't we just accept each other, and that's the way you are and that's the way you are. I was born this way, you were born that way. That's pluralism. But here's what really gets me. Knowing that this one particular God that demands exclusivism is still included with people who know that with the other gods. Thinking, I know you think you're the only one, but I still want some of you in with my mix, maybe as insurance or backup plan or whatever. But God, in the 10 Commandments, gave a reason for that very first command. What was it? What's the first command? You shall have no other gods before me. And he's not talking about, I don't want anybody ahead of me and I want to be first in line of all your gods. He's saying, I want to be the only God. But what was the reason? Well, but the reason he gives is, I'm jealous. Our God says, for I'm a jealous God. And he does not want to share the throne with anyone. Would you, if you were God, that's a hypothetical question because you're not, but if you were God, would you want to share the throne knowing you were the one that created everyone and every material that exists that an idol's made of, you created? You wouldn't want to share with anybody else knowing what you know, would you? So, what other thoughts do you have? There are a lot of material here, and we won't be able to dive into all of it, but any other things right off the cuff that you want to discuss? Let's go through the outline then. Why did assassinating your king get to be so popular all of a sudden? Power. I want that power. I want that limelight. I want the show. It's good to be king for a day, right? Or at least 6 months or 1 month. I wonder if they'd still say the same. Why did God inflict Uzziah with leprosy? Here we just have it in this text that God afflicted him with leprosy, and he had to live in a separate house, and Jotham was over the palace and the people. His pride? Well, we're actually told, just not in 2 Kings, but open your Bible to 2 Chronicles. We're told why he has leprosy. In 2 Chronicles, chapter 26, Melba, whatever you cooked smells so good. She provided our meal for the kids and families tonight. 2 Chronicles 16, verse 16. But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride, what did you say, Mom? Pride, you were correct, led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense, and Azariah, the priest, with 80 other courageous priests of the Lord, followed him in. They confirmed King Uzziah and said, "It is not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. That is for the priest." The descendants of Aaron, who they were kind of doing what King Saul had done while he was waiting on the prophet. You know, he got tired of waiting and decides to do it himself. He says, "That is for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, who have been consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you've been unfaithful, and you will not be honored by the Lord your God." Uzziah, who had a censer in his hand, ready to burn incense, became angry. And while he was raging at the priests in the presence before the incense altar in the Lord's temple, leprosy broke out on his forehead. When Azariah, the chief priest, and all the other priests looked at him, they saw that he had leprosy on his forehead, so they hurried him out. Why? He's unclean in a holy place. Leprosy's unclean. Indeed, he himself was eager to leave because the Lord had afflicted him. King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house, leprous, banned from the temple. Jotham, his son, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land. That's all 2 Kings tells us is that last part. But now we know the real story behind it. Yep. Why does God allow an ungodly nation like Assyria to come in and help carry out his judgment? I've often wondered this. Because he definitely does. And later he'll use Babylon to do the same. And we've seen before where God has used outside nations. Why did he allow Israel to be in Egypt in the first place and become slaves to the pharaohs? You know? And many other instances in which God would have sent, like for example, in our story tonight, he's the one sending Rezin, king of Aram, against his people, and the other dude, Pekah or Pekah, I get those two confused. And why would he do that? Why doesn't he just go ahead and send lions in all the time when people do wrong instead of ungodly people of other nations? Or bears? We do, don't we? Just things to ponder. And then the fourth question here under the ponder section. Do you still think he does that today? Can he and does he use ungodly people to carry out his will against those who are supposed to be the godly people? That's interesting, isn't it? Why should he change? He's told us up front, doesn't he? I, the Lord, do not change. Why would he? Yes, Sam. Mm-hmm.
You're not doing it right, and let me explain it to you. And these people don't explain it to me.
Yeah. And this basically lends itself to the statement God wants to make by making them an example and fulfilling what he said he's going to do. See, I told you so. Those are the only things I had to ponder about tonight. You could have gone into why ripping pregnant women open and all that. What did they do wrong? Well, that's just a part of the narrative we will not know about. Why people do what they do. Why people sacrifice their own children to an idol we won't know. Let's go to discussion questions. Why do people want to change the way God wants them to worship? Yeah. I've often said this, maybe you've heard me use this, and I don't mean this to be sacrilegious and irrespectful in any way, but I mean, if it was my choice, if I had my, what do we call it? If I had my druthers, whatever that means, if I had my druthers, I'd want banana pudding and maybe Dr. Pepper on the communion table. I mean, seriously, what would you want? What do you like to eat? Does everybody like drinking grape juice? I know a bunch of people that don't. Now, I do like grape juice, by the way. But why that? Why couldn't it be something else? I'm not arguing, huh? Yes. Well, bananas have been around for as long as grapes have. But banana pudding has the vanilla wafers in there. There is a wafer in there. I'm just trying to show the point that I don't get what I thought would be better to be acceptable to God. Naaman thought 2 other rivers were better than the Jordan to dip in. Why would I need to go dip in this muddy Jordan? Abana and Parfar were up at the further top of the Fertile Crescent and probably ran clear. They'd probably be colder, but I don't get to do what I want as a way or a means or a measure of worshiping my God. That's not worship to God, that's worship to, myself. What excuses do people give as to why they don't attend church? What have you heard today? They don't believe in organized religion. Okay. Huh? Full of hypocrites. That's probably the number one answer right there. I don't have the clothes to wear. Anything else? I got to go to a football game. The same person is probably saying the pews are too hard and it's too cold or hot in that auditorium, but they'll sit on a hard seat at a football game, right? Or in a deer stand. Now, you know, you're encroaching on a lot of little personal space there. I don't believe that to be in lieu of God's worship, but I do believe you can be thoughtful of God in the deer stand. Huh? Sleeping in on Sunday morning. Is there really a God? Okay. Jeff? COVID. Let's just boil it down to this, because every one of these things, I believe, this is a correct assessment. Every single one of these things that have just been mentioned are surface things that all point to, I want to do what I want to do. And I don't want to do or be made to do what I don't want to do, because whether that sets in or not with you, that is the problem going on. I don't want to be cold or hot in that situation. I don't want to listen to a preacher in his long-winded sermon. I don't want to sing songs without instruments, or I don't want to, I want to do the Lord's Supper every week. All based on you setting yourself up as God. But I'll go if you do what I want there. And that's like trying to worship yourself and God at the same time. Somebody asked, does it still happen today? And I think it does. Why, instead of being baptized for remission of sins, why can't we do something different besides that? That's a hassle to have to provide water and have clothes and towels, and it's an inconvenience to get all wet. Why not just take some water and spritz me, You see how this all goes? In Christianity, this still infiltrates today. And I think it still infiltrates the Lord's church today in ways that maybe are a little more subtle, but they do. Number 2 discussion. Isn't it interesting that a foreign king is more interested in restoring godly worship than the godly kings were? Shalmaneser's idea is, let's get one of the priests to go back and tell people who are not Israelites how to worship, because he has more respect for the land that they'd come from than the people who were living in the land had for God. That is a mystery. And they existed for as long as they had, because for the sake of David, right? But that even runs out, at least to a certain degree. Ultimately, for the sake of David, God does save his people, which for the sake of David is why we're here today, by the way. Because it's through David's loins. Yeah. But that's not so surprising when you realize that that's because the Israelites before them had not driven them completely out, keeping them at bay, and they were copying them in the first place. It's not that the outside nations began to do just exactly like the Israelites had done. They were doing what they always did, that the Israelites had adjusted to and had become doing. Why would people think you can worship God, who demands exclusive attention, and worship other beliefs as well? Now, let me tell you an interesting thing also about India, and that is the opportunity for Christianity there is great. And here's the reason why. We can offer prayer to people, and the moment you mention prayer, India is interested. They'll come into a prayer meeting because there's nothing threatening about that. They go into temples all the time. They go to religious services. They are so religious in India. I mean, here in America, what would you say the percentage of people that are religious is? You think we're in the minority? I'm talking about any religion. It doesn't have to be Christianity. How religious do you think Americans are? I know there's an argument about atheism as a religion, but not very religious, really. If you do what? 2%? If you think about India, it's way different. Everybody's religious in India. When Paul stood on Mars Hill, the Areopagus, what was the first thing he said? I see that y'all are very religious. Because they had this hill full of idols. I don't even know if we in our country could be even said we're that religious, but how can you... it's just a hard thing to understand why you think you can still include Jesus in that paradigm and that God with the other gods you also want to take along with you. And that it's okay when Jesus and that God demanded exclusivism. And I have an answer as to why it's happening, because people are rationalizing that Jesus really isn't exclusive and that God isn't exclusive. And the only way you could come to that conclusion is if you never read the Bible for yourself or read the truth about Jesus. You've got a false narrative of whom you think God is and what Jesus is about. Because we have people all the time that are thinking, Jesus would accept everybody no matter their sexual orientation, their religious beliefs. He loves everybody and would never say a crass thing or judge people. That's my Jesus. Go ahead, Sam.
That makes everybody feel good.
Exactly. Which goes back to, I'm God. And if I want to include Him as God, it's under the umbrella that I'm getting what I want first.
Well, and it says too that I don't have to recognize my shortcomings.
Yep. Just,
You'll accept me as I am.
yeah.
Without any change in me.
And you can see sometimes where, and I'm seeing that, we don't have a bell ringer, do we? I'm seeing that we're a minute over. I'll sign off here in just a second. We're seeing that people tend to want to deny their own frailty and deny their imperfections and deny the true picture to continue the false narrative. And I think to the point that they actually do believe this is genuinely me. They've suppressed it for so long. Right. Because who likes change? And repentance is all about change. And by nature, we don't like change. The fourth discussion question, what can we learn about the demise or exile of Israel? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. We could have a good discussion on that, but let's wrap this up with the three things to consider. And there was so much more I could have put here, but I was not wanting to print a second page, and to fit this on here, basically I came up with these three. God's prophecies are always fulfilled, and this includes the Jehu to the fourth generation prophecy, as well as the prediction that if you don't straighten up, I'm going to abandon you. Do we have that today? Do we have a prophecy like that that's pending today? Well, okay, Jesus is coming back is a prophecy yet to be fulfilled, but I'm also thinking of the letters to the seven churches of Asia there is a way in which I think that transcends just the first century. Do we, if we become unfaithful, can God come and remove our lampstand? Yes, He can. Yes, He can. It matters with whom we associate ourselves, and God can use ungodly people for His purposes. So that's our study for tonight. Next week, we will start with just what's left of the Judah kingdom, because we're done with Israel kings. That was 20 of them, by the way. So we've traveled 200 years into this study. Does it feel like it's been 200 years long? All right, we'll sign off. We'll see you Sunday morning, Lord willing.